And about the use of the armed forces abroad, well, how else? Yesterday we signed the agreements, and these agreements with both Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, it has articles that say that we are going to help these republics, including with the military. And since there is a conflict with this decision, we make it clear, if need be, we are ready to assume the obligations, exercise the obligations we assumed.
Добрый день, агентство ТАСС, Вероника Ичоткина, тоже по теме Донбасса.
Another question about the Donbass. Obviously, Ukraine doesn't want to recognize the sovereignty of the two people's republics. So our decisions are not welcome with the Kievan authorities.
What was that?
What I'm saying is that Kiev itself does not recognize the Donetsk and the Lugansk people's republics, and they're not happy with our decision to recognize the two republics. So after everything that happened yesterday and later today, do you see any prospects for rebuilding relations between Russia and Kiev? And if it is possible, what should Moscow do and what should Kiev do to achieve that?
These matters were raised during our lengthy talks and negotiations with our European counterparts, and we discussed that with the Americans as well a number of times. I don't think we talked about it publicly, but I will now. Obviously, the question is what should happen from both sides, from Kiev, so that we consider this situation settled in a long-term perspective, so that the situation calmed down and we wouldn't talk about any conflicts, especially armed conflicts. So I don't think it's a secret. There is nothing secret about that. The first thing that must be done by everyone is to recognize the will of the people who live in Sevastopol and Crimea. And I have said that on many times. So how different is this, as this referendum was then in Kosovo, this will, expressing this will? How different is it from what happened in Kosovo? Because there was a referendum there, and I would like to reiterate one more time. No one did that at gunpoint. No one forced them to go to the voting stations. They did it voluntarily, and they made the decision to join Russia, and we should respect this decision. Those who have any doubt, they think that they are democracies, they should recognize this, because that's the highest form of democracy, the referendum. And we have said that publicly a lot of times, and that we debate a lot about with Washington and with NATO. We are categorically against admitting Ukraine to NATO because it poses a threat to us, and there is an argument, and I have talked about that in this very hall a lot of times. And in this regard, we come from the assumption, and a lot of people talk about this in Western capitals as well, that the best solution for this matter would be if our Western counterparts could save their face, so that the current Kiev authorities renounce from joining NATO by themselves, by their own will, and they would remain neutral. That was the second point. And thirdly, unfortunately, it's not relevant anymore. I talked about resolving the problem of the Donbass via peaceful talks and implementation of the Minsk agreements. And finally, the most important thing, fourth, everything that has been said before could be turned around in one moment if our so-called partners will pump the current Kiev authorities with the state-of-the-art weaponry. So that's the most important thing. To a certain extent, current Ukraine should be demilitarized, because That's the only factor that could be controlled, that could be monitored, that could be reacted to. Because everything else could be changed tomorrow, like the current head of Ukraine did when he basically started criminal persecution of the former president for this alleged treason, because he doesn't like the Minsk agreements. And they could also disavow all the agreements that I have just spoken about if they were to be adopted by the current authorities. He could just move to Washington, to Paris, to Berlin, and we would have been left with the country, armed country up to its teeth, that has anti-Russian sentiments. But it's impossible after the current authorities are talking about their ideas.
Alexander Yunushev Live.
Alexander Yunushev Live. Mr. Putin, yesterday in your address to Russians, you talked about Zelensky's statement, not for the first time, I think, that, according to him, Ukraine could have nuclear weapons again, could join the nuclear club again. But are these just words, or we face a real threat that next to our borders in Ukraine there will be nuclear weapon? Thank you.
I've just talked about that. I believe that those words were aimed at us primarily, and we have heard those words. Since Soviet times, Ukraine has had very wide nuclear competences, so to speak. They have a number of nuclear power plants and strong nuclear industry. They have the technology, and they have the specialists, so it's very easy for them, it would be really easy for them to gain nuclear weapons compared to many other countries that need to start from scratch. And you know that very well. There's one component they lack. They cannot enrich uranium, but that's just a matter of hardware. It's not something Ukraine cannot solve. This problem can be solved relatively quickly. As for the systems of delivery of these potential nuclear weapons, there's actually old Russian and Soviet missiles that can reach targets 100 kilometers away. It's very much feasible for Ukrainian industry to produce those. But what's the threat to Russia? Even if Ukraine gains tactical nuclear weapons, that means a strategic threat to Russia. That is what we must consider now. Because once you have 100 kilometers, then you have 300 kilometers or 500 kilometers, and then Moscow would be in range of a potential adversary's nuclear weapons. That would be a threat, and that is how we see it. That is why we have treated this so seriously, and we will continue to do so.
So let's give the floor to Kolesnikov. Andrei Kolesnikov, Khorasan Daily. Mr. Putin, how do you think, in the modern world, in today's world, could it...
Story we are breaking at this hour, Russian invasion on Ukraine soon is what it looked like. The indication has been clearly given by Vladimir Putin there. You just heard, in fact, Shiv Arur, our executive editor, is getting us the very latest on that big story. I think, Shiv, it's crystal clear that it's trouble when it comes to the tensions between Ukraine and Russia, and it's just going to get worse from here on.
Now, this is definitely one of the, the more belligerent speeches that we've heard the Russian president give in recent days.